Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the State Natural Areas Program Roundtable today. I'm Lisa Smith, Executive Director of the Natural Areas Association. And while we still have a few folks who will be joining us, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We've got a full program for you today. The Roundtable is a unique opportunity for those of you who manage natural areas for state agencies to learn from each other on a variety of topics relevant to your day-to-day responsibilities. This is a roundtable that's open to everybody, everybody that's interested in the topic. It is a topic that is chosen by our committee of state natural areas program representatives. So we hope that you find today's program meaningful to your work. We do encourage all of you to engage with speakers and each other through chat. We're all getting very used to using this tool for communicating these days. During the presentations, feel free to pose questions and offer your own ideas and resources. We will have Q&A with presenters that will take place after each of the presentations. But our goal is not only to provide you with this learning opportunity, you hearing from our presenters today, but to create an environment where we can be resources to each other. And that's proven to be, this has proven to be a really great way for sharing information. So please feel free to do that in chat. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Natural Areas Association for those of you who might be new to us. We are a national nonprofit organization that serves practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes, all in an effort to protect biodiversity. We contend that protecting natural areas in perpetuity requires quality science to inform your practice and access to reliable resources. So given this, we provide science-based content for natural areas practitioners and researchers seeking applied science, practical solutions, and knowledge transfer related to the management of natural areas. The sectors we serve include state agencies that house natural areas programs, as well as state parks, forestry programs, wildlife and fisheries programs. We also serve land trusts, regional agencies, as well as the federal land management agencies, all of whom manage land for their conservation of natural areas values. We share a suite of programs, products, and services that offer a broad spectrum of current and emerging issues, methodologies, and best practices, and we do this in a manner that's useful and convenient for busy practitioners. We're always interested in hearing from you on how we can best serve you. Our programs are designed to achieve on-the-ground outcomes and to encourage your participation, especially with one another, as I mentioned. So I know you've registered for this program to hear from our presenters, but I'd like to highlight two items from NAA, two up-and-coming opportunities for you. One is to engage with our Natural Areas Journal. The October issue of the journal is now available. This journal is a peer-reviewed quarterly publication focused for natural areas practitioners. It has withstood the test of time. It's been around a number of years. It's available in digital format, so you can check out the latest issue by going to our website at naturalareas.org. And I'd like to also make you aware of a new virtual program offering from the Natural Areas Association, the Innovators in Natural Areas Science Lecture. This inaugural program will be happening Thursday, December 1st, at 12 o'clock Eastern Time. These lectures will highlight innovators in natural area science in order to communicate new scientific discoveries that contribute toward the protection of ecologically significant landscapes. December's virtual lecture will feature Dr. Suzanne Simard, the author of Finding the Mother Tree. Some of you may have read this book by now. If not, I highly encourage it. It's an excellent book. It speaks to us. We are so honored to be able to host Dr. Simard on the 1st. She'll be speaking specifically to our land management audience, and there'll be ample time to engage with her. So you won't want to miss this special program. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn the program over to our State Natural Areas Program Committee Chair, Mike Leahy. Mike?
Thanks, Lisa. And hello, everybody. This roundtable is going to be focused on how forestry and wildlife management work for the benefit of our native biodiversity. And we often work with and are wildlife biologists and foresters at the local, state, and federal levels in terms of agencies and non-government organizations. And so often our organizations are tasked with managing not just game species and wood products, but looking at a more holistic range of habitat and species outcomes. And ecologists realize that the restoration of some natural communities can benefit both the non-focal game and non-game species, as well as produce wood products as a byproduct. So today we're going to look at different case studies where wildlife biologists and or foresters have joined forces with ecologists and botanists in restoration projects with a number of different great outcomes across different taxa groups. So after each presentation, there will be a brief time for questions and answers. And if there's time at the end of the program, we'll have a brief open forum. You can, during that time, either communicate a new topic or raise your hand and we'll allow you to talk, or you can put your message in chat. And with that, we'll go ahead and start with our first presentation, which is recorded. This presentation is by Ryan Spotts and Bill Holloman. They are both with the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, and unfortunately, they both had a large meeting today, which included most of their commission, and so they could not present live, so the presentation is recorded. However, we will try to answer any questions, but if you really have detailed questions, you'll have to email Bill at bill.holloman@arkansas.gov. And Bill has worked for the National Heritage Commission in Arkansas since 2000. He has over 25 years of experience in science and conservation. And he is currently now their director, had been a chief of research and also a zoologist in the past. Ryan has worked for the commission for a number of years now too, starting in 2018, first as a land management specialist and now as chief of acquisition and stewardship. And they are both passionate about the natural heritage resources of Arkansas. And with that, we will go ahead and start their presentation.
Good morning. It's great to be here. I'm Bill Holloman with Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission. I'm also joined by Ryan Spotts of our agency. And we'll be talking today about open pine flatwoods habitat restoration in southern Arkansas. Of course, any project like this requires a lot of partners. Instead of showing them at the end, I'm going to tell you about some of them now. In large part, I just want to show that we have a lot of partners involved in federal agencies, state agencies, timber companies, and so forth. So when talking about open pine habitat, I'm going to use the red cockaded woodpecker as surrogate and show a range map of where the red cockaded woodpecker historical distribution is. And for those of you not familiar with red cockaded woodpeckers, it is a federally listed endangered species, and it is dependent on large-scale open pine habitat, so mature pine with park-like conditions. And these are pines of the southeastern United States. You can see from this map, which is the map, granted, is 10, 15 years old, but the yellow areas were areas where they were still occurring, and the blue areas were areas where they once occurred but had become, were no longer occurring. And restoration is occurring in some of those areas now. But you can see that the open pine habitat, using the historical distribution of RCWs as a surrogate, covered extensive areas of the southeastern United States. In Arkansas, we have maps showing the distribution of the red cockaded woodpeckers dating back into the late 1800s. And you can see in the south and southwestern part of the state, they were in almost every county. But they also, these open circles towards the top in the Ozarks show that they did occur in the late 1800s in the northern part of the state. And actually, that distribution went all the way up into the Ozarks of southern Missouri. And if we look at the counties that occurred in the state, and we can see the different ecoregions, we can see that they occurred in a large number of counties. But now they only occur in these counties, and the truth is they're only in these populations, the red cockaded woodpeckers. And that's where our large areas of open pine habitat occur. One thing I want to really go over on this slide, it's been considered endangered since 1970, but at one point it was considered to be one of the most abundant avian species in the southern pine forest. And that's because there was large scale areas of open pine habitat that supported this species. So this is one of our key focus area maps that helps guide our protection efforts. And in southern Arkansas and the upper West Gulf coastal plain ecoregion, we have a number of polygons where we focus our areas for protection. And then we also have areas that we call facilitation corridors. So if something comes available in any of those areas, we can consider them the highest priorities or the polygons. But we are trying to create these stepping stone corridors in southern Arkansas to facilitate the rescue effect, but also shifts in distribution of a number of species. But what it does show you is that a lot of our efforts are along the Ouachita and Saline rivers. And our, excuse me, and our efforts there are along the lower two terraces, especially the lowest terrace, the Deweyville Terrace of those two rivers. On this map, you've been doing mushrooms, you might want to look away. We've got a lot of activity going on, but one of the things that show you are several millions of years ago, southern Arkansas was covered by a shallow sea. And when that receded, it left these rolling sandy hills called the Tertiary Hills. And then two rivers coming out of the Ouachita Mountains have cut down into those, creating three different terraces. And the lower two terraces are ones where we are doing a lot of our protection and restoration efforts for open pine habitat. And we call them pine flatwoods because the area is dominated by pine. And with them being terraces, it's very flat habitat. On this map, you can also see these yellow dots. These are areas where red-cockaded woodpeckers are known from. Most of those are historical records. And one thing that was interesting to me, I was expecting most of the records to come from the rolling tertiary hills, which are better drained. But it was actually the other way around. The lower two terraces had most of them. Now, this is an incomplete data set because a lot of this land had been converted prior to us getting any data on that. But nonetheless, it does tell us quite a bit that these terraces are very important from a standpoint of open pine habitat. And one of the reasons we think it is important, the open pine flatwoods are important as compared perhaps to the tertiary hills, is that they are younger, more recently created lands, as recently as 10,000 years ago to dozens of tens of thousands of years ago, but they're less dissected than the much older, millions of years ago tertiary hills. And so with that, you would have in effect larger burn units, larger areas that fire could carry. Also want to mention within these flatwoods, the thing that really attracted our attention initially were these patch communities, and primarily these open saline barrens. This is a site called Warm Prairie. It's actually a type of glade. And some of the areas so extreme that nothing grows. You can see these salt barrens in there. But on the edges of those in the cryptogamic crust, you get a federally threatened plant called geocarbon minimum. And the largest population anywhere is at this site. But then on the edges of these, you have the matrix community. You have the pine, oak, flatwoods. When we first started protecting these sites, and even when we first started managing them, when we started doing burning these areas in the 90s, this is what it looked like. You don't have much of an herbaceous layer, you don't have much sun hitting the ground, and not a lot of diversity, a lot of leaf litter. Still attractive and important, but not as diverse and biologically important. But fortunately, we have learned to take this and turn it into this. This is the same area after being restored. It's just covered with a little blue stem, liatris, and many other species. We first started looking at doing this. I did some bird surveys out there around 2002 or 2003, and working with Tom Fota. This was his vision of opening these areas up with timber thinning, and I was like, man, you're crazy, man. There aren't any big pines out there. It's all small, because that's about all you could see from the edge of the roads. And when you would go into these areas, it was like swimming through them. It was so thick with young trees. But sure enough, we get the timber crews out there, and they start thinning it. And you can see the large trees, and you can start seeing the vision that Tom had. So this is one of the timber crews we use. This was very different for us. This was back in 2005. So we had a tendency to kind of freak out when they first did it. You know, they're taking too many trees, and it turned out that we needed to take more. And on the other hand, the timber companies were great to work with because they took a lot of pride in what they were doing. It was something different for them, and they wanted it to turn out well. Now, when they take the timber, they don't always, you know, they're taking what's commercially attractive to them. They leave a lot of things that aren't necessarily attractive to them. And then so another tool that we use going in there is called a forestry mulcher or grinder. And this is one right here, and you can see on the left, you can see some large trees in there occasionally, but after, you know, the grinder gets through and gets rid of the small stuff, you can see that it very nice open habitat. I also want to note that I mentioned red-cockaded woodpeckers earlier, but we are managing for what we consider to be the site-appropriate habitat, and our target is what we believe occurred there at the time of settlement. So it's got quite a few oak trees and other hardwoods as well. And the crews we worked with, as we worked with them and they worked on other projects, they graduated from those small grinders to these larger ones. And I've got to say, when you watch these, it's almost like, you know, watching a wreck. You know, you should look away. You just can't. It's fascinating to watch them just transform the habitat fairly quickly. And you can see in the back, this is an area where a grinder done some work. You can see in the background how thick it is. There's a person standing right here. That's Samantha Shaman. So these large trees were freed up from the dense understory. And so you could be left with this really nice canopy structure of open pine, hardwoods. But even once you get there, you freed up all this sun to hit the ground. And in a lot of cases, what you do is you end up releasing sweet gum and other undesirable trees. Sweet gum's a great tree, but it did not occur there at this frequency. So we're managing for not only the structure, but what we consider site appropriate composition. Now, Southern Arkansas has for decades been industrial timberland, so not everything that we have is mature stands. So some of the stands can be 20 to 30 years of age, as this stand where we did a thin for paper, for them to make paper. What's that called? Pulp thin. Thank you. And then, but the pulp market is not great in Arkansas. We have way too many acres in Southern Arkansas that need to be thin. So we kind of get low as far as getting quotas to be able to get that. So another tool we've turned to is the pellet industry, and there's a pellet mill in northern Louisiana. So they come in and they cut the trees. They actually have a mulcher on site that blows it into the back of a semi container, and then they haul that down to northern Louisiana. And the nice thing is it gets everything out of there. So as soon as you have the fine fuels to burn, you can burn. So you don't have to wait for the larger material to melt down. And in fact, this is less than one growing season after a thin, and you can see the fine fuels are coming in and you're starting to get some diversity of ground cover. Some of the trees we got were, you know, the stands we get are so young that it does, you know, we'd have to wait forever to do that. And the trees will grow really, really slow. You do a pre-commercial thin. So we've done that on about 500 acres. And it was interesting to me. We did this during April one year, did about 500 acres. And this site had, you know, beforehand, it's like a desert underneath. There's nothing that likes to use this habitat. But afterwards, during this time, once they thinned it, we had migratory birds using this habitat. In the areas they had not thinned yet, there was nothing in those. And then we get all the way down to the early part. We've bought areas that have not had anything, that have been harvested but not been replanted. And we've replanted those in shortleaf pine. Of course, most of you know that for these industrial timberlands of the southeastern United States, that they favor loblolly. So in many areas, once they cut timber, they replant loblolly only. So in this case, we replanted in shortleaf. And the seed source we used were local genotype seeds from Warren Prairie. We paid the our forestry division to collect the seeds and then grow the seeds, and then we planted them out there. And I can tell you, shortleaf pine does grow a lot slower the first 10 or so years. And then the main tool, of course, is getting to this prescribed burning. This is one a crew from the Nature Conservancy, our main contractor for doing prescribed burning. And this is a backfire they have going here. They're in an area where they've burned before. So just this same spot I just showed you there, this is a gate that goes into that management that used to be there before we started doing all this management. So this was taken like in 2004 or 5. You can say this gate we actually kept locked. And to get into this management unit, which was about 100 acres at that time, you had to unlock that gate and drive in. But once we started the work, it became a gate to nowhere. So we translocated that gate and it's being used somewhere else now. And then over time, you start getting some burns in there. The habitat starts coming back. It's a little weedy at first, a lot of dicanthelium, some other things. It slowly starts coming back. You will see that we do get some shrubs in there and good shrub layer. About a couple years after burning, we have a 2-year burn cycle sometimes because it is so wet in these flat woods that you go 3 years. But you don't want to have a 3-year burn cycle and accidentally, because of certain conditions, have to go 4 years. Because if you do, it's in a lot of cases like starting over. This is just about half mile south of that last site. Really pretty site. And this one is in the summer before we would do a burn. And you can see there's a lot of diversity of vertical structure. There's different size shrubs in there. We'll talk more about some of the things that benefit from that here in just a moment. So when it gets to about this point here, then after that, you do another burn, set it back so that those shrubs don't turn into trees and start choking out the sunlight hitting the ground. This is another site that the first time I went to it, it was so difficult to get to. You couldn't take a gator into it or ATV of any sort. You had to walk into it. It was very difficult. But now you can see with all the habitat work, it's coming along. And in fact, red-cockaded woodpeckers nest there, and they've been nesting in natural cavities in this site. This is another site that the restoration work's been very successful. And there's about 6 years difference in these last 2 photos. It's both the same site. You can see that our burn program is maintaining that open pine habitat. And ultimately, it's prescribed burning. And here you can kind of see the dynamics of that. On the left, you can see where the fire has gone through. On the right, it's still open, but you can see where a lot of that woody vegetation is coming in, and the fire is about to creep in there and knock that back. So an interesting dynamic. I mentioned some species that have benefit. One of the ones that are a couple of the ones that are most interesting to me were the prairie warbler and the hooded warbler. So prior to us doing work there, prairie warblers were basically non-existent. So you can see here very low numbers, and hooded warblers were pretty abundant. The hooded warblers use these mature pine oak habitat, but they use areas where there's a canopy gap, so some sun hitting the ground, and you get a few shrubs come up, and hooded warblers do well in that habitat. Prairie warblers do not use that habitat. They need this very open woodland, savanna-like structure. And when the shrubs come in, they'll use that, and then they kind of just shift around as the shrub habitat's available. And you can see over time, prairie warblers went from being essentially non-existent to being fairly common. And hooded warblers still occur there, but in lower numbers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Spots. Ryan?
Hey. So one of the challenges that we face when we're managing in pretty much any part of the state, but especially these areas that we do a lot of disturbance activities in, are invasive species. And so just to go over, there are native invasive species and non-natives. And so the big difference is that the native species are native to that particular area, but generally there's a lot fewer of them, or they're only in a certain area. Something affects how many or how far they grow, but then that's been removed at some point through human activities, generally, lack of fire, change in hydrology, change in climate, as the temperatures change, it'll shift, things like that. where non-native invasive species were brought to the US or to this particular area from somewhere else, sometimes on accident, you know, just was in a crate or in somebody's boot or something or other, or on purpose because they thought it would be a good plant for erosion control, or because it was so pretty, or whatever the case may be. And so when they get here, there's nothing that's evolved to prey on this particular species. And so depending on the situation, sometimes nothing at all happens, sometimes they just explode and take over. But with both native and non-native species, they tend to be fast growing, prolific, lots of seeds, and a lot of them tend to be generalists where they can grow pretty much anywhere, and they just outcompete what should be there. A couple examples of the native invasive species that we face in Arkansas and elsewhere are sweet gum and saltbush. And so with sweet gum, Bill kind of alluded to it earlier, it's a light-seeded species that can grow in wet, dry, shade, sun. It's not very picky. And so it just takes over and it grows quickly. And so if we don't use fire or herbicide to keep it under control, it'll just shade out everything else and outcompete everything else. Saltbush is a lot smaller, doesn't generally get to much bigger than, you know, head height, but it can just take over. So these are examples of kind of what they look like closer up. And then for saltbush, this is a different natural area outside of the flatwoods, pine flatwoods, but it gives a good example of what can happen if you don't take control of it. And so this is a fire line that somebody put in right on the edge of our natural area. And so the one side is open prairie that we maintain. The other side is maintained by someone else as a lawn. And then in the distance, you can see just this wall of shrub, and that's all saltbush. And that's just the people who own it don't maintain it as yard or prairie or anything else, and it just stays saltbush forever. Non-native examples, again, there's plenty of them out there, but these are two of the ones we face a lot. And in the pine flatwoods, these can become massive problems. Chinese tallow tree, some people call them popcorn trees, chicken trees, things like that, was brought here because it's very pretty. It turns lots of colors, even in the South where things don't do that as much. It's got these cool little seeds and these waxy little leaves, but it's also allelopathic. So when it drops leaves, it makes the soil chemistry unfavorable for anything but itself. And it just grows like mad. It root sprouts, sucker sprouts, everything. And so you get one or two seeds brought in when a flood comes in from a neighbor's property, or when birds bring seeds in or something, and it just, next thing you know, that's all you have. Sericea lespedeza is a lot smaller. It's a little, you know, ground plant, little shrubby nuisance, but some people think it's a great idea for quail. Other people use it for ground cover, and it just takes over. There are native species of lespedeza, but this is not one of them. And it just turns into a monoculture. And so again, this is not in the pine flatwoods. This is another natural area in the coastal plains out near the Blackland Prairie area. And just to show you, the roadside on the right is not our natural area. It's owned by a timber company, and it produces just obnoxious amounts of seeds that then get onto our natural area across the road. And so to help reduce the seed source, we contacted that company, and they didn't want us spraying chemical on their side of the road, but they agreed that we could mow it. And so what we've gone is every month or so during the growing season, we go in and cut it down to ground level as best as we can. And it's really cut down on the seed source going across the road. And so it helps tremendously lessen the amount of herbicide that we end up deploying on our property across the road. And so just to show you, this is that same roadside with just been mowed. And on the left side, you can see what's ours, and it's not lespedeza or Sericea lespedeza. And so when you have invasive species, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. First thing you got to ask yourself is this a problem? Different species do different things. So kudzu Sericea lesbites, a Chinese tallow tree, they're going to take over. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Where there's some things that, you know, it might spread a little bit and then it's just going to kind of either take care of itself, or it's just going to stay a very, very small component of that system. And so maybe that's not the best place to spend your resources. And so thinking about what density is a problem for which plant, which location. And then are there logistical constraints? Is there a really sensitive spot right next to it where you cannot use herbicide, or where you cannot take a four-wheeler, things like that? That might change how you end up treating these plants. And then lots of things to consider when you try to think about, okay, this is a problem. Here's what I have. How do I actually get rid of it? Time of year can be a big issue. You know, is the plant putting out leaves or storing resources for the winter? What's around it? How bad is the infestation? Do I need a crew of 2 for a day, or do I need a crew of 10 for a month? And then doing research and looking at research done by others. So anytime we have a new infestation, we'll go look through the literature, try to figure out who did what, how did it work. But then sometimes we can't find anything that works for us because there's either a lot of disagreement on what works best, or the only references we can find for this particular species was from a different part of the country or something. And so we'll go out and we'll take out 3 or 4 different chemicals that we have that have been successful in other instances, or that someone said worked, and we'll spray different pieces and come back in a week or 2 and say, okay, what worked best here? Best way to keep it under control is to not let it get there in the first place. And so washing your equipment before you go in and before your contractors go in, it's a lot easier to make your crew do it than it is to make a contractor do it. But if you can have them use a pressure washer on their four-wheelers, their grinders, whatever equipment they're using, you'll see a lot less. We find a lot of invasives right along fire lines, or right along lines where a grinder entered and exited an area. And so if you can just get them to wash it, that will help a lot. And then scouting areas for new occurrences, especially areas like that, along your parking lots, roads, fire lines, along a neighbor's boundary where, you know, they have cattle, things like that. And then areas where there's disturbances, whether it's human disturbance, going in and cutting trees, thinning things, or from natural, if there's a storm that blows over some trees. There's a lot of time this big input of light, and then all of a sudden all these species take off, natives, desirables, non-natives. But then you want to make sure that the non-native invasives that are a problem are not one of the ones that takes off. And then educating and working with your neighbors and the general public. People don't know that they shouldn't plant privet that they bought from the nursery down the road, because they don't even know what it is. It's just pretty and it stays green during the winter. We've reached out to neighbors to say, hey, we're fighting this plant. We see it's on your property. Can we help you deal with it? Or can you help us deal with it? Or whatever works. And a lot of the time they're open to it. And then monitoring going forward. You need to know if what you're doing is actually working. So we've started a program where we go in and intensely map an area every 3 or 4 years, depending on the situation. And we map every inch of it. And we say exactly what invasives we find and where. That way we can look at that and say, okay, what we've done over the last few years has worked or hasn't worked, or it's gotten rid of the invasive, but it's increased this weedy species rather than this desirable species. And we can reevaluate. Another way to do that, if you don't have the time or the resources to do serious mapping, you can do vegetation plots or transects. You can create spreadsheets that track your time or your chemical used and compare that year to year. Photo points are also extremely useful for presentations, but also just to know, okay, this is how this has changed over time. And then again, look at what you are repopulating. Is it what you want? Are you driving the succession you want? Or are you introducing a whole bunch of things you weren't intending on? And then take all of that information you get with that monitoring and adapt what you're doing as needed. And it may be that you reevaluate and change things every couple of years, every 5 years. But as long as you're doing the research behind it, you'll know if what you're doing is correct. That is what we have.
The next presentation is one that I worked on a bit with 3 other colleagues here with the Missouri Department of Conservation. So I work for the department here in Missouri as a natural community ecologist, and worked with 3 other staff: Angela George, who is a forester with our department, Chris Newbold, who is a wildlife biologist, and Steve Bubeck, who is a natural history biologist. And this will tell a story of work that both private land and public land, forest and wildlife management has been used to both promote game and non-game species, as well as some forest products. So with that, go ahead and start the video, and then I'll be here to answer any questions that you might have from this presentation. Hello, this is Mike Leahy with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to the Missouri River Hills Priority Geography in Central Missouri. And this is going to be a collaborative presentation by some of our foresters, wildlife biologists, and natural history biologists working across public and private lands. And we will go ahead and discuss some of the work that's going on in this geography for natural community conservation. And we have 3 speakers today. It'll be Steve Bubeck, Angela George, and Chris Newbold. And we'll go ahead and pause in between each of the speakers to change over the speakers. So sit back and listen to an example of cross-disciplinary work here in Missouri.
Hello, I'm Steve Bubeck, natural history biologist in the Central Region for the Missouri Department of Conservation. At the boundary between the glaciated plains and the Ozarks is a rugged topography known as the Missouri River Hills. Located in between Columbia and St. Louis, Missouri, this landscape is still primarily wooded. It hosts a diversity of different natural communities and native species, ranging from xeric rock outcrop communities known as glades to rich forested ravines. The Missouri Department of Conservation has focused public and private land management in this geography that is straddled on the east and west sides by 2 designated Missouri state natural areas: Danville Glades Natural Area and Razor Hollow Natural Area. This presentation will highlight resource management efforts and monitoring utilizing a variety of practices in this area. While most of North Missouri was characterized historically by prairies and savannas, the southern edge of the prairie plains became dissected and rugged as the land reached the Missouri River to the south, the land where the glaciers stopped. This represents the largest block of woods north of the Missouri River, diverse natural communities, and unique species. Conservation targets in this geography include limestone glades shown here. These glades support populations of the state-listed prairie dandelion and other interesting taxa, such as the Great Plains ladytresses, striped bark scorpions, and Texas brown tarantula. Other targets include a variety of fire-adapted woodland communities, such as this dry limestone dolomite woodland. Lower in the landscape, protected sandstone bluffs, mesic forest, and Ozark headwater streams provide summer refugia for a variety of state-listed amphibians, including the Ozark Ouachita endemic ringed salamander, the more northerly distributed wood frog, and the more easterly distributed four-toed salamander. Upland forest supports scattered populations of the yellow lady slippers orchid and the state-listed American gromwell. The region also supports a healthy population of timber rattlesnakes, hiding here. The many headwater creeks within the area support populations of the heartleaf plantain, which is listed in all states within its range. Another conservation target of the region is maintaining the dominance of oak in the forest canopy. In the absence of disturbance, many forests are slowly succeeding to sugar maple, a process called mesification. Using sustainable forestry practices to regenerate and recruit oak species also creates early successional forest habitat for declining songbirds such as the yellow-breasted chat, misnamed prairie warbler, and the blue-ring warbler. According to entomologist Doug Tallamy, oaks support more life forms than any other North American tree genus. In Missouri, entomologists have documented 260 species of life-feeding insect species using white oak. Wood products are a byproduct of these efforts and provide for value-added products such as barrel staves.
Hi, my name is Angela George. I am a forester within this geography, and I work on both private land and public land, and I'm going to talk a little bit about both. The Missouri River Hills has a rich history of landowners active in land management. Land ownership demographics vary greatly in the geography. This ranges from local farmers who make a living off the land they own or lease to absentee landowners who might own property for recreational value or simply a financial investment, or a combination of all of these things. Most landowners, though, have one thing in common. The majority of the landowners we work with are interested in making their properties more attractive to wildlife. That might be as simple as planting a food plot for deer, or as they become more familiar with land management practices, could lead to natural community projects such as restoring glade, woodland, or other natural communities. The River Hills is a diverse landscape, and it's difficult to sum up land management practices in just a few slides. Generally speaking, common wildlife or woodland management practices are also beneficial in terms of managing natural communities in the region. Locally, unmanaged woods have the tendency to be overstocked with trees, and due to the lack in fire frequency, our oak, hickory, forest, and woodland types have been invaded by fire-intolerant species such as eastern red cedar, sugar maple, and ironwood. These types of woods, if left unmanaged, are not supporting wildlife populations at their greatest potential. You'll remember a large part of our landowner base is interested in managing for increased wildlife populations. This is where wildlife management and natural community restoration go hand in hand. Timber stand improvement, prescribed burning, and/or glade restoration projects are very popular in the River Hills. Timber stand improvement basically frees up desirable species, in our case, predominantly trees in the white oak and red oak groups, by removal of overstocked and poor quality trees through mechanical thinning. This is great for both timber production and wildlife management. The result can look messy at first, but landowners quickly realize the wildlife benefit of creating additional structure in the understory. Canopy gaps created during the process are critically important for restoring the herbaceous understory community as well. Incorporating prescribed fire is important both in terms of restoring glade and woodland communities and to promote a diversity of herbaceous species preferred by most wildlife species. Properly conducted, fire increases plant diversity, is an important part of managing invasive species, stimulates oak regeneration, and is prescribed in nearly every glade and woodland project on the region. Glade and woodland restoration is not only popular for its wildlife impacts, but landowners quickly realize just how diverse and interesting these communities truly are. We may cut cedar and restore fire to increase turkey brood habitat, or for beneficial deer browse and bedding areas, for example. This is typical of many landowners wanting to manage for wildlife. We go from wanting to raise more turkey broods or creating bedding habitat for trophy deer to full-on natural community management at that point. It's a win for both wildlife management and restoring native habitat types. The next few pictures illustrate a progression in community restoration on a landowner's property in River Hills. The private lands conservationist started working with him in 2017. Here's a picture of what most of his glade and woodland habitat looked like at the time. You'll notice very little herbaceous vegetation, and the mid-story is full of sugar maple and eastern red cedar. The landowner's main objective was to create deer and turkey habitat as he and his wife purchased the property for recreation and hunting opportunity. They were awarded cost share funding through MDC's Landowner Assistance Program and hired a local contractor to mechanically thin the unit. This picture was taken summer of 2017 after the thinning. Though it looked messy, it created instant deer habitat and the landowner was happy with the results. In February 2018, he used the same contractor to conduct a burn. He then burned it again in January of 2020, and here he is, our proud landowner, standing in one of the small glades in the unit in June of the same year. This is just one example of many accomplishments through partnerships with landowners in the Missouri River Hills. We've had a lot of success working with landowners in the Missouri River Hills geography. To date, most landowners have done at least one or more habitat improvements with our assistance. While I could give you a long list of alphabet soup acronyms of partners that we have worked in or financially supported the Missouri River Hills effort, one of our biggest cooperators has been the local chapter of the Quail and Upland Wildlife Federation. They're working just as hard to promote private land management within the geography as we are. Other major cooperators include the National Wild Turkey Federation and the Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative. We also are fortunate to have at least one logger and several consulting foresters having the conversation with landowners about the importance of the geography and the need for management. They frequently attend our landowner workshops to present as well. The nearby Independent Stave Company, located just outside the geography in New Florence, has also been a good cooperator, presenting to our landowners at workshops about growing quality white oak. The Missouri River Hills priority geography is bookended by 2 conservation areas with state natural areas, where staff have continued to implement the same practices as we advise private landowners. We consider these areas as a demonstration of what is possible for long-term natural community restoration and sustainable timber management. As a forester, most of my work has been prescribing and implementing management on Danville Conservation Area, so I will go into detail of some of our recent work there. This map shows the acres that have been managed with prescribed burning in just the last few years. Since Danville is primarily a woodland and glade complex, fire is critical to maintaining the rich diversity of ground plants that make up these natural communities and sustain wildlife species. Prescribed burning has also been used at Danville to reduce undesirable plants, such as invasive exotic species and undesirable tree species like maple and ironwood. By replicating the natural disturbance of periodic fire, most woodland and upland forest hillsides also maintain ample oak regeneration. Based on a forest inventory, management prescriptions are developed to maintain the highest quality natural communities. This map shows the stands that have had trees mechanically cut in just the last 6 years. The stands in yellow were non-commercial thinning, either clearing cedars off of glades, a woodland thinning to reduce undesirable tree species and to increase sunlight to the ground to support a diversity of native plants to support wildlife, or to give more growing space to the best quality crop trees that will serve as future timber products. Based on that same inventory, decisions to conduct commercial timber sales are made. Timber harvests support the Missouri economy and is also a useful tool for thinning trees and creating early successional forest habitat for wildlife like migratory songbirds. Stands in blue have been selectively harvested in the last 4 years. These harvests remove the lowest quality and mature trees to allow the best quality, vigorous trees to continue to grow, as well as promoting oak regeneration and, again, wildlife-friendly ground plants. The stands in red were clear-cut harvested, which removes every tree and regenerates the stand by allowing young oak seedlings to flourish in full sun. Clear-cutting is the most efficient way to sustainably regrow high-quality oaks. Note the clear-cut stand on the far west side of the area. This is actually along a county road for all of the public to see. The decision to clear-cut it came from the inventory data, but its location is serving as a visible demonstration to the public about the benefits of this harvest practice over time. This stand was harvested a couple weeks ago, and the best quality oaks will now be free to seed in and continue the next generation before they are removed in a future sale. and this stand was clear-cut harvested 2 years ago. Note the abundance of 4 to 5 foot tall oak regeneration and dense ground plants growing. This shrubby habitat is hard to walk through, but is ideal for many migratory songbirds.
Hi, I'm Chris Newbold. I'm a wildlife biologist who works over here in the Missouri River Hills. Another state land project of note that we've done at Danville Conservation Area is our conversion of all of our ag crop fields into prairie plantings. Over the last 6 years, approximately 100 acres have been taken out of production and seeded with native prairie seed that was collected and with a flowback and hand collected from Prairie Fork Conservation Area and Tucker Prairie Natural Area nearby. Early plantings tend to look like this one. Visually striking monocultures, and in a couple years, the other flowering species will catch up, but the work doesn't end there. After the planting, we then have to make sure that we are following up with invasive species work in these plantings and making sure that they're kept at a minimum. Additionally, give you an idea of some of the monitoring that we've done in the geography. In 2015, we surveyed our public lands to get a presence of the amphibian species that were present. And at that time, we recorded 17 species of amphibians, including 10 species of frogs and 7 salamanders. Additionally, since that time in 2015, we have worked on both our public lands and private lands to create and maintain additional fishless pond habitat for forest amphibian use. On our public lands, we have renovated several ponds that contained fish to make them more suitable for amphibian breeding. Renovation work would include the removal of the fish if needed and modification of the pond structure to have a gentle slope to ensure that ponds will, and also ensure that the ponds will not hold more than 3.5 foot of water. Tackling about 5 ponds a year, we've completed 15 of these renovations. On public lands, we've also used cost share assistance on our private lands to construct small fishless ponds, and to date, we've completed 2 of these projects. Through this amphibian sampling program, we've increased our knowledge of the distribution of these secretive species. Before we designated this as a priority area, little sampling had occurred for amphibians outside of the conservation areas. This map shows all the amphibian species of conservation concern found from 1980 to 2014. In that time, we put 104 amphibian records in the heritage database. We added 26 more records from 2014 to 2017, shown here in triangles as a result of the surveys of 20 fishless ponds and 200 cover boards on our conservation areas. The survey was conducted by a team of wildlife, forestry, private land, and outreach education staff. The greatest success is finding new records on private land. We work with landowners to educate them in the value of that old fishless pond near the edge of the woods, and that it doesn't need to be renovated to benefit wildlife. Several have been excited at the opportunity to have us dip up their fishless ponds to see if egg masses are present. In fiscal year 15, staff from Wildlife, Forestry, Private Lands, and O&E Division monitored 20 summer breeding bird species within the priority geography. A total of 176 monitoring points were surveyed, including 30 locations on 11 cooperating private landowners. This survey was conducted again in 2020 to see if we had moved the needle on improving the spectrum of bird habitats needed for these bird species within the priority geography. Surveys have shown that in both 2015 and 2020, early successional forest species were the least common within the priority geography. In fact, early successional bird species are slightly more common outside the priority geography than within. Woodland species, however, are quite common within the priority geography and were the most common habitat yield in the geography, with their presence most common on our publicly managed areas. In general, both forest and woodland species are more common on our public lands than on our private lands. Our bird presence data suggests that we still have some work to do on creating early successional forest habitat within our geography and increasing woodland habitat on private lands within the geography. Occupancy rates for each habitat guild group has stayed steady between 2015 and 2020. And in the case of early successional forest species, particularly on private lands, their percentage of occupancy within the priority geography has shown a significant increase. We've made many positive strides within the priority geography, but we have our challenges, and I would say that our challenges of working within the geography are not unique. We're starting to see invasive species in places that were blessedly free of them just a few years ago. These just add to the workload of maintaining and restoring acres. Another challenge is that even with all of our communication.
So yeah, the significance of the 3-foot depth on the fishless ponds, that was determined by our state herpetologist, Jeff Brigler. I think that's kind of an ideal depth for some of these amphibians in terms of the deeper the pond, the higher probability of getting fish species accidentally established in them. And that's where that comes from. And then the proportion of work on private versus public land, I would have to get back with Angela and Jordan and Chris on that. We do quite a bit of private land work in that geography, but I don't know the exact answer on that one. Yeah, the timber management is a little bit different depending where you are in the geography. So on the designated natural areas, we haven't done any commercial timber management. It's all been non-commercial, and we primarily have used non-commercial thinning and fire. And then on private lands, it's been a mix of different silvicultural techniques depending on the goals of the landowner. And then for overlay shore stands of forest, well, on the natural area, these are low site index sites. Natural areas, most of those areas, we're allowing the trees to mature and die on their own schedule. On private lands, typically it's a mix. And then in the cases where we have done the clear cuts, they're smaller clear cuts. These are less than 10 acres. And they're in areas where you typically have black oak and northern red oak that are declining pretty quickly and dominate the stand along with scattered white oaks. And the goal is to get a greater proportion of white oak regeneration in those stands. And that's on both private and public lands, not in the natural areas, but in the more of the general matrix of the system there. So this gives us an opportunity, I think, to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next set of speakers. That way we'll have a little bit extra time here for these other talks. And this next presentation on uneven age silviculture and oak hickory pine stands is here from Missouri. Again, it's Pioneer Forest. We will learn about the forest soon. Our two speakers include Jim Golden, who is a board member currently on the LAD Foundation. And Jim comes with us with a long history in forest ecology. He got his PhD in silviculture and forest ecology from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Then he worked in Arkansas and worked there for 28 years with the Forest Service and some years with the University of Arkansas. Worked extensively on shortleaf pine woodlands down there. And since he's retired, we're lucky enough to have him here in Missouri now, in Springfield, Missouri. But he hasn't really stopped in retirement. He is a volunteer on our board of directors with the LAD Foundation. He's received some great awards, including the Society of American Foresters Award as a fellow in 2020, Arkansas's Foresters Hall of Fame in 2021, and a lifetime achievement in silviculture from the Forest Service. And then our other speaker, Roger Still, is the foundation manager of Pioneer Forest, which is the largest private landowner in Missouri. And Roger has over 25 years of experience here in Missouri and in the Midwest in conservation projects, ranging from being state director of the local chapter of the Nature Conservancy to work as vice president of the Mississippi region with the National Audubon Society. also work here with the Ozark Regional Land Trust, the Greenbelt Land Trust of Missouri, and a variety of conservation projects spanning both Missouri and other countries with the goal of bird conservation. And so he is currently the director and manager of the foundation. And with that, we'll let Roger and Jim go ahead with their presentation, and I'll.
Hello, everybody. Delighted to be here today in virtual space with you all. Jim and I are. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to just orient us to the LAD Foundation, and then we'll show a video and then have a very small handful of slides and hopefully some time for discussion. So what you're looking at here may be repetitive for some, but what you're looking at here is a map of the LAD Foundation's land holdings in the state. The LAD Foundation stands for Leo A. Dry, our founder, who in 1951 founded Pioneer Forest in Southeast Missouri, focused on single tree uneven age selection forestry, which we've done since that time. The foundation itself was formed in 1962, and then in 2004, Leo donated Pioneer Forest to the foundation. So we have a very unique structure in that we're a not-for-profit operating foundation that's focused on sustainable silviculture and conservation as a demonstration forest. If you look at this map very briefly, obviously so many of you know, but I'll point out the brown is the Ozark National Scenic Riverways that radiates from the top left to the bottom right. That's the current river essentially. And then the radiation of brown to the left of the map is the Jack's Fork. Green is Mark Twain National Forest. The light blue is the Missouri Department of Conservation. And then our lands, the Pioneer Forest lands, are all in yellows from Montauk all the way south of Van Buren. I'm going to talk about Eastern Whippoorwill after the video. Look at that big block of our Roger Pryor backcountry near Echo Bluff State Park. That 62,000 acre area is going to be an important component of what I talk about after the video. Mike, Jim, do you have anything to add to that before we go to the video, or say anything about the video?
Yeah, I might just introduce the video a little bit. In 2021, SAF held its national convention virtually, and the silviculture instructors subgroup of the silviculture working group in SAF consists of all of the university professors and some academic or some government researchers in forest management and silviculture. And they have a virtual, they usually have a field tour before the national convention. And so they had a virtual field tour at that virtual convention and put out a call for videos from members of the working group to highlight different kinds of forest management that occurs. And so I brought the idea of doing a video on Pioneer Forest's uneven age silviculture to that virtual tour. And it was happily and eagerly accepted. And Denise Vaughn was the producer of it. Many of you, some of you might know Denise. And we did a 30-minute version of it, but then Roger had a great idea of really having a 6-minute version of it also, just as an introduction to what goes on Pioneer Forest in the context of forest management practices that occur. And I think the video is intended to introduce what the forest management practices are on Pioneer Forest, and then Roger's going to speak a little bit to the value that silviculture activity brings in context of species conservation. So with that, I think we could roll the show. Welcome to the Ozark Mountains of southeastern Missouri. My name's Jim Goulden. I'm a retired research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service. And today we're going to look at managing oak, hickory, pine forests in the Ozark Mountains. We'll tour Pioneer Forest, the largest private landowner in the state, with about 146,000 acres in 6 counties. I'd like to introduce Jason Green, the forest manager here at Pioneer Forest, and Brandon Kuhn, the chief forester for Pioneer Forest. This land has been managed using conservation principles ever since the founder, Leo Dry,
began buying land in the Ozarks 70 years ago.
When Leo initially purchased most of his property in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of the land was cut over. It was very, very abused. That really lends itself for conservation and restoration work.
Pioneer Forest uses uneven age single tree selection. That's our method of choice because we feel like it leaves the forest intact. It gives us periodic income. It's aesthetically pleasing, and it's just good for soils and water conservation.
With uneven age single tree selection, you're basically pulling those worst trees out and you're letting the remaining forest grow.
Many timber harvests in the Ozarks are not done sustainably. While big trees are cut, rotten trees are often left behind. And the small trees that remain may not be younger, healthier, or the right species. This is called high grading, and it can harm forests.
High grading is essentially you're taking the best trees and then you're leaving everything else behind. And so when logging company is done, you haven't done anything to improve quality. In fact, you've done the opposite. You're left with just basically junky trees.
That's about as small as we can mark. So we're in a stand on Pioneer Forest in Shannon County, not far from the Current River. Jason and I have come in and done a marking here so that we can demonstrate our cut trees and leave trees ahead of a logging crew on Pioneer Forest.
When we walk into a forest, essentially we're looking at and assessing each individual tree by tree. And when we do that, we're basically doing the opposite of high grading. We're picking the worst trees out and leaving the best, highest quality trees behind.
In the background you can see a really nice 20-inch scarlet oak that we've left. And beside it here we've got a 12-inch black oak that we've got paint on. The trees that we put paint on are going to be the cut trees. The trees without paint are obviously the leave trees. The reason we chose to leave the scarlet oak, it's a fantastic tree, high quality, high vigor, has very thin, tight bark, full crown. And so we immediately identified that as a leave tree that's going to put on a lot of volume in the next 20 years. The tree beside it that we cut is a lower quality tree. It's slightly overtopped by the large diameter tree. I'm going to go ahead and remove these trees. I'm marking these for the loggers to come in and cut. The reason I chose to mark this tree is the defect that's visible here on the lower part of the tree, as well as some dead branches. This has probably been scarred by a skidder or potentially even fire, and it's just not healing over, and the insects have gotten into it and it's beginning to rot.
Some of the things that the foresters think about as they're marking a stand is, will it last? The trees that are marked are trees that have a poor likelihood of surviving to the next harvest.
In a natural setting, trees are gonna die eventually. And so single tree selection mimics that in that we speed that process up by selecting those trees and creating those small gaps in the forest that would occur as if a tree died.
This is a white oak seedling. By doing a harvest, it allows these canopy gaps to be kind of scattered throughout the forest, and you have a lot more direct sunlight that hits these types of trees and allows them to eventually grow into the mid-story, hopefully into the overstory. If we don't harvest, then the canopy's closed, and eventually we lose trees like this.
Here we are in a stand that was harvested on Pioneer Forest in this past spring. Do you think the thinning that you've done will release those trees and allow them to continue to grow?
Well, looking at this stand, Jim, I'm really pleased with it. We've got a lot of growing space for these young white oak trees to fill, and we've got a lot of sunlight hitting the floor there. So we're hoping to see some good regeneration there.
These stumps behind me on my left illustrate the philosophy of single tree selection harvesting on Pioneer Forest. 2 lower quality black oaks were taken from the stand, and they're releasing 4 or 5 of these beautiful straight white oaks. It really represents an investment in the future product quality on Pioneer Forest. Over the last 70 years, careful management using single tree selection has really paid off.
Our volumes have increased over time, really tremendously. It's over 5 times the volume today of when Leo initially purchased it.
Today, sales of timber products cut from Pioneer Forest have an impact to the local economy of about $13 million annually.
And our forest looks completely different than what it did in 1952.
Jason and Brandon and the staff at Pioneer are doing an outstanding job in a sustainable context, managing for high quality saw timber that's providing benefit to the local economy, but also providing benefit to the ecological communities in the Missouri Ozarks, and especially on Pioneer Forest. And I commend them for the work that they're doing.
Thanks for that. Appreciate your attention to that video. We got the longer 30-minute version is available on the Foundation's website, www.ladfoundation.org, and we also have a host of other materials on that website for anybody who's interested to learn a little bit more about Pioneer Forest. The fundamental thing that's going on is that we're really providing habitat that's underrepresented on the landscape in the Missouri Ozarks, and that has key significance for some wildlife species. And I think Roger can speak to that.
So that framing of our silvicultural methods, going back to the structure of our organization, we made an increased commitment to integrate those silvicultural methods with biodiversity conservation. And so many people on this call know Rebecca Landaway, used to work for the Nature Conservancy in the air. We've hired Rebecca as our chief ecologist about a year ago. And Rebecca has started to conduct ecological planning, reaching out to partners, and really taking a deeper dive into our natural communities and implementation of conservation eventually to meet our demonstration forest mission. Here you see Bee Bluff and the current river there, and a different set of habitat types. And we've begun to break that down into across our 144,000 plus acres, break that down into a number of natural community types so that we can manage and restore the conservation that we need across both our woodland and forest types, and then unique special features moving forward. So that increased commitment's consistent with our nonprofit mission. Now, I offer you, lo, a Eastern whippoorwill in my hand. Whippoorwills are extraordinarily important culturally in the Ozarks, as so many of us know. Myself, as a kid on Ozark farms, I grew up listening to them across a gravel road in my grandparents' front room at night as I would sleep there. And what we've discovered in beginning to talk about whippoorwills as a conservation focus in the Ozarks is that people cherish it. They cherish this bird, and it's a good rally point for conservation efforts. It's also a good fit ecologically. The kind of disturbance that is created by our single tree uneven age selection, some work by Frank Thompson, research out of Frank Thompson's shop and a number of other places, University of Illinois, Ohio State, indicates a strong compatibility with our kind of management method, especially when utilizing fire in the landscape as well for the enhancement of habitat for this bird. In fact, I flagged that 62,000 acre area that we own and had you remember that throughout the entire upper Midwest, the University of Illinois this year did abundance surveys and discovered that in our Pioneer Forest area, in that 62,000 acre block, that was the highest abundance recorded across 5 different states. I'm happy / disappointed to report that we're tied in Wisconsin for one location, but we have a really sacred obligation to take care of this species that I think also intersects well with a number of natural community type activities as well. So there's been a lot of interest since we've started talking about whippoorwill conservation among state and federal agencies, and our intent is to enhance that as we move forward with collaboration from a broad range of partners in that map that we talked about. Now, with that basic framing, why whippoorwills? Well, why whippoorwills from a conservation standpoint is they're declining, and they're declining precipitously, as a lot of aerial insectivores are. This bird has declined 70% since 1970 across its range. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as you can see here in their land conservation strategy, is very focused on this bird moving forward as I said, our partners. So we're aligned with a federal focus on this through the Fish and Wildlife Service as well. If you look at that range map, there's something very interesting that the research has shown now as we've tagged these birds. And that is that the red, of course, is their breeding area. The yellow is migratory. The Ouachita Mountains, there's an interesting thing. All of the birds in our upper Midwest part of that breeding range, they compress during migration in the northeast part of Texas, southwest part of Arkansas, and that little sliver in Oklahoma there of the Ouachitas. They all in migration concentrate to an uncommon degree there. And then they do not go over the Gulf of Mexico, but they go all the way to Chiapas and Oaxaca and part of Guatemala, the research has shown. So there is an opportunity here to do a full life cycle conservation effort. We as the LAD Foundation will certainly focus on the breeding ground, but we're facilitating that broader effort as well across that range. Finally, here, Jim, you've been the star of the show here. You framed it, you're in the video, and here's Jim looking at some of the research we've done in that area where we had so many different whippoorwills that were detected. Rebecca is there with researchers, with Neil Humke, who some of you know, and they're in looking at a moth insect trap there, because it appears that insect abundance is very critical, especially moth abundance, to the ecological health of eastern whippoorwill. And those studies, that data has not been completed and synthesized yet, but some of the hypothesis here that undergirds this is that insect diversity in a landscape where we have the silvicultural methods that we have the big block of forest, that that size of forest and also insect abundance is driving a lot of good habitat for whippoorwills, which is good for our broader matrix forest. And we hope to have that as a surrogate to then also connect to other natural community types and their proper management. So with that, Jim, I will turn it back to you for you to cap this in any way you see fit before we take questions.
Yeah, I don't know, Roger, can you go back to the map of the area? Just as a, that's just fine to close this out a little bit. So the 143,000 acres, Pioneer manages that area using 20-year cutting cycles, which gives us a target of about 5,500 to 7,000 acres of harvest every year. In 2021, we didn't quite get that. We harvested 5,100 acres using our single tree selection approach, which means in those stands, we took out a third to a half of the poor quality trees and left a half to 2/3 of the better quality trees throughout the site. Under that harvest activity, we harvested 9.3 million board feet of saw timber, 5.1 million board feet of pallet wood and blocking, lower quality hardwood products, and 500,000, nearly 600,000 board feet of white oak stave logs, which were targeted for the independent stave mill primarily. That's a total of about 15 million board feet, all using single tree selection and cutting the poorest quality trees, leaving the worst quality trees. That represents an investment in the future quality of Pioneer Forest, as I mentioned in the video. Just in terms of round numbers, these numbers are generally available in the annual report, so I don't think I'm being too cavalier about this, but that timber harvest generated about $3 million in timber sales in 2021. The operation of the forest, the salaries, the fleet, the insurance costs, forest expenses, office expenses, real estate, travel, training, all used up about half of those funds, which left about the other half of those funds to be reinvested in the foundation for larger scale kinds of ecological values and products. It just speaks to the importance of being able to generate income using forest management activities in an active forest management context for the betterment of conservation. And it's one of the few examples of that in private land ownership that I'm aware of in the Mid-South at any rate. So again, speaks to the importance of integrating effective forest management, creating optimum habitats that are underrepresented on the landscape, and seeing the values in wildlife and in the conservation of flora and fauna that are adapted to those habitats that are underrepresented on the landscape. And I think it's a good story to tell, and Roger tells it really well. Thanks, Roger. And I'll turn it back to the group.
I would also add that Mike Leahy is on our advisory committee. So the facilitator is in the family here, Mike, and thank you for that.
I don't know. We have some questions, so I'll go ahead and ask them. Using this management, do you have exotic and invasive species issues? What is the fire and what is the fire frequency?
We don't really have, I think the most prominent invasive species issue, correct me if I'm wrong about this, Roger, is in our glade kind of conservation efforts where we have, where eastern red cedar, of course, burgeons. And so we do some work to try to handle that. We have some parts of the forest, about 30% of the volume on pioneer forest is in shortleaf pine. A good portion of that is in stands that are dominated by shortleaf pine. And it's only in the last decade that we decided to start to undertake some work in using prescribed burning and thinning, similar to the kinds of questions that are going on in the Western Ouachitas with respect to open pine woodlands for red-cockaded woodpecker that Bill Holloman talked about in the first presentation. But we don't generally burn over the entire forest, no. And especially try to avoid burning in some of our oak woodlands where we don't have a prominent fire presence. One of the valuable species that we have is scarlet oak, the big tree that you saw in the video, and it's highly sensitive to fire. So really, we're trying to target areas where fire is important, and that's going to include our pine areas and especially also our glade-related areas.
I would just add to that to say that our founder and his wife were resistant to fire management and fire ecology. They then, while Leo was alive, he enabled and approved moving into fire management. About 2 to 3% of the forest is now under fire management, and we are expanding that. I would say in this ecological planning effort, one of the opportunities, and this relates to the research on whippoorwills too, is to do some perhaps demonstration efforts that expand that into a combination of silvicultural and fire treatments.
One of the challenges is that we've got good markets for a lot of the hardwood species, but there's not a really good market for shortleaf pine in Missouri, which is a challenge, given that given that 30% of the standing volume on Pioneer is in shortleaf pine. And I keep wondering whether we could build a network of landowners, including MDC and private landowners and Pioneer Forest, to provide broader interest to the mills, especially in Arkansas, which is only 4 hours away, to try to tap into some of the valuable shortleaf pine resource that we have in the state. Because the quality of shortleaf pine that's on Pioneer Forest is clearly the equal of the quality of stuff that's being harvested and sold for good rates down in Arkansas. Let's see, any folks on the line working on oak regeneration issues? We are including we do include a test, or rather a sample in our 5-year periodic harvest or periodic inventories that we take. In fact, we're taking our 5-year inventory this year, and we do look at oak regeneration as part of that inventory work. We have a little bit of question about whether the volumes, as volumes continue to increase in the forest, whether we're going to see an adverse effect on oak regeneration. We paid for a student out of the University of Missouri to look at that question in the past few years, and his manuscript's about ready to reach the refereed literature. We also, but it speaks to another point that I made in the talk. There's a lot of areas on Pioneer Forest where we have 6 to 12 inch white oaks that are just waiting to grow and turn into stave logs. So there's some real opportunities, I think, to continue to manage that question. Let's see, another question. Are you concerned about reduced number of standing snags and down woody debris? Well, given the kinds of natural disturbances that occur, we do find ourselves with trees that die between the 20 to 25 years that it takes us to get back to a stand. We'll see some mortality from lightning strikes. Down woody debris, when we harvest our stands, we let all of the top wood and everything associated with harvests rot on site, decay on site, and so that helps with that context a little bit, I think.
Jim, we're gonna have to cut you off here.
Geez, I wondered why.
Time.
Why am I not surprised that I'm the one talking?
Although we may still have time at the end to wrap up. Those are all really good discussion points. And thanks, Jim and Roger, for that excellent presentation.
Good work, Roger.
Thank you. Transition here now to Carl Nordman, who is our final speaker today. And Carl is a regional vegetation ecologist with NatureServe and has been working in that role for over 20 years. He has worked across the Southeast on a variety of different natural communities. It also has been a botanist with the Tennessee Natural Heritage Program, and has extensive work in field ecology in the Southeast US. So with that, we're going to segue to Carl's talk.
I'm Carl Nordman, vegetation ecologist with NatureServe. My presentation is an introduction to rapid condition assessments of shortleaf pine and oak woodland ecosystems. Many thanks to the Natural Areas Association for allowing me to present this work. NatureServe is a conservation science not-for-profit. Our mission is to provide the scientific basis for effective conservation action. Our decision quality data, scientific expertise, and tools help focus conservation actions on the most important places and reduce impacts on biodiversity. We answer key questions about biodiversity. What exists, where are they found, how are they doing? We work with partners to identify and conserve rare species and ecosystems. The NatureServe network includes natural heritage programs and conservation data centers across North America. Many work closely with natural areas programs and many other conservation and land managing agencies. We're driven by science rather than advocacy. For an introduction and background is 4 items. In setting the stage, there's been a big decline of open pine and oak ecosystems. To reverse this decline, guided restoration and management is needed. NatureServe has partnerships with the U.S. Forest Service and other state and federal partners. These partnerships are important in bringing together agencies and landowners. Ecological integrity assessment uses 6 steps for developing rapid condition assessments for oak, pine, and oak ecosystems. In setting the stage, one may ask, why develop rapid condition assessments? Longleaf pine woodland occupies less than 5% of its historic extent. There's been a 95% decline. Shortleaf pine woodlands have also declined and have continued to decline since 1990. These declines represent a loss of wildlife habitat and declines in many species. Shortleaf pine and oak ecosystems are on many national forests. U.S. Forest Service and many other partners joined in a shortleaf pine initiative, which has hosted biennial meetings and created a restoration plan. The focus on active management, which is needed for restoration. And oak woodlands are a focus area in red, showing the Region 9 Southern Tier National Forests, partnership with Missouri Department of Conservation and U.S. Forest Service. Reversing the decline. It's an example of how many acres of high quality open pine exist in the Southeast. In white, we have various scales of land of concern from site to region. Some answers can come from spatial data from land fire or more specific site-based regional inventory data. And there's 3 assessment levels. 1 is remotely sensed, 2 field-based rapid assessment metrics, and level 3 is intensive plot-based metrics such as U.S. Forest Service FIA. Our focus is on level 2 field-based rapid assessment metrics, but we have a regional perspective with a diversity of users and landowners. The overall goal is a set of metrics that can be applied quickly to stands regardless of condition or past management. Ecological integrity assessment is an assessment of the structure, composition, function, and connectivity of an ecosystem as compared to reference ecosystems operating within the bounds of natural or historic disturbance regimes. To make the conceptual definition operational, we need indicators of ecosystem structure, function, and composition informed by the ecosystem's natural range of variation and linked to management needs. Our methodology is focused on how to pick those indicators for a rapid assessment using our 6-step process. So the steps for developing an assessment method, models, and metrics. Step 1 is a classification framework of ecosystems or natural community types. And step 2 is a development of conceptual models and identification of key attributes. Step 3 is to specify the level of assessment, 1, 2, or 3. Step 4 is select the metrics for each key attribute. Step 5 is determine the metric assessment points or condition thresholds. And step 6, provide practical management-based tools. So this is a general approach that can be used to develop a rapid assessment method. Step 1 is specify the ecosystem types. Our rapid methods may need to factor in how these ecosystems differ in their structure, composition, and function. We applied the U.S. National Vegetation Classification groups, which is a fairly broad level of the U.S. National Vegetation Classification. And longleaf pine groups, there's 5, and they align with site conditions across the range of longleaf pine. And shortleaf pine and Appalachian pine groups have more similar site conditions, but they reflect regional differences. And just a little bit more detail on that. Specifying the ecosystem types here using the U.S. National Vegetation Classification Yellow are longleaf pine groups, which follow site environments from xeric to dry, mesic flatwoods, wet pine flatwoods, and savannas, which can occur really across the range of longleaf pine on the coastal plain and even places in the Piedmont and interior highlands. In green are shortleaf pine, U.S. national vegetation groups, which are usually on dry sites and have more regional differences. Step 2 is the conceptual models. Historic reference conditions shown on the left from 1890. We see, for this example, in Ozark shortleaf pine oak woodlands, by 1996, hardwoods had come to dominate with a closed canopy, grasses had declined, shortleaf pine was not regenerating, and perhaps even oaks were not regenerating. So this is from Guyette and Day, 1997. We appreciate being able to use this. Continuing with step 2, we have an oak woodland example, which would have a ground layer with certain level of floristic quality and characteristic species. Oak in the canopy and with regeneration. And fire plays a role in the regeneration of the oaks. The structural range of variation, without management action, a prairie could become a woodland and then a forest, losing the prairie diversity over time. But a woodland could include the entire variation in structure at some scale within, for instance, patches in a woodland landscape. We talked earlier about the 3 levels of assessment. We're developing a rapid assessment level 2, which is effective for monitoring restoration. This is quick and multi-purpose. Step 4, select the metrics using criteria. How to efficiently measure key ecological attributes. We want to be efficient in terms of time, cost effectiveness, and the value of the data in terms of what it tells you about management objectives and whether you're reaching those objectives. Also, make it accessible to field workers and not require high levels of expertise. Use familiar and easy field data collection methods, such as visual estimates of percent cover, 10x basal area prism. Continuing with step 4, select the metrics. This is example metrics for southern open pine woodlands with metrics for canopy, mid-story, shrub, and ground layer. All have been reviewed and our partners provided great input on these. We work with partners. There's no one set of metrics. There are various ways to implement this approach. Here we show a relationship between NatureServe's ecological integrity assessment and the Missouri Department of Conservation's Community Health Index. There's a lot of know-how with state level agencies, and we can potentially implement state level metrics more broadly. That's one way we work with our state level partners to take innovations and know-how and try to apply them more broadly. Step 5 is determine the metric ratings, assessment points, or condition thresholds. Assessment points can be thought of as signals of impending ecosystem change. assessment points allow monitoring data to more easily inform the management of open pine and oak ecosystems. They set the bounds of condition categories according to ecosystem type. For example, basal area assessment points for longleaf pine and shortleaf pine vary by ecosystem type. This is a step 5 example of metric assessment points. Percent cover of native mid-story fire-tolerant woody stems. Less than 20% cover would be excellent or good. Greater than 25% would be poor. And as mid-story increases, seedling recruitment and herbaceous ground cover decline, leading to condition decline. Each metric is fully documented in the format on the right. So including like the background literature, rationale for selection of the variables, and measurement protocols. And this is from dry Ozark, Ouachita oak woodland. This is another example where the mid-story shrub and ground layer metrics with the canopy are rolled up, and these can lead to an overall EIA rating. So particular metrics or strata can indicate the problem areas. So it's not, you can use the metrics rolled up or focus on certain metrics where your problem areas are shown. The Ecological Integrity Assessment and Community Health Index is a current partnership. We're working with Missouri Natural Heritage Program in the Missouri Department of Conservation, NatureServe, and the U.S. Forest Service. And protocols have been field tested, improved, and tested again. These are focused on oak woodlands. The methods were shared with other partners through a workshop in 2022 in May. And the goal is to apply a merged approach and tailor it to the Southern Tier National Forests, like the Mark Twain, Shawnee, Hoosier, and Wayne National Forests, and perhaps the Monongahela as well. And then step 6 is provide the tools. I want to highlight this recent paper in the Natural Areas Journal in 2022, Mike Leahy and Jennifer Buchanan, on the Community Health Index for tallgrass prairies. And this is an example of the Community Health Index application to dry oak woodlands in various conditions. The index scores 55 is good, 38 is fair, and 27 is low. So what you see in the larger picture in the background is really has a diverse ground cover and a more open woodland character. NatureServe and U.S. Forest Service got this paper published in 2021 in the journal Forests. It's rapid ecological integrity assessment metrics to restore wildlife habitat and biodiversity for shortleaf pine oak ecosystems. And then this is an example of land use index, which is a landscape context metric. It can be applied in GIS to a local land cover data or raster land cover, such as land fires, existing vegetation. It just looks at within a 500-meter radius outside of your stand of concern, what is the predominant land use, and scoring, completely developed areas and paved areas as 0, natural forests or natural areas of any type as 10, and then intermediate lands of various cultural uses are scored in between. So these are publications and some websites that we want to share from our partnerships, both with U.S. Forest Service and other agencies, and with Missouri Department of Conservation, their Community Health Index, and links to those papers that I showed. And those, I think, are going to be posted in the chat, so everybody can get those links from the chat. Thank you, and I can take any questions.
So we've got a few minutes for questions here. Questions for Carl, as well as any questions in general. We really won't have a lot of time for an open forum, but we could have a few questions of general interest if folks have any, or recommendations for future topics of State Natural Areas Program Roundtable. We're always interested in those as well.
So, Mike, we have a couple of raised hands. Kim?
Yeah, I had a question. I know that your study specifically focused on oaks, but could you apply the same sort of methodology to other species as well?
Is that question for me, for Carl Nordman?
Yes.
Yeah, it's well, it's these oak woodlands and oak pine woodlands. NatureServe has also developed ecological integrity assessment method for wetlands broadly, and our state partners in Colorado, for instance, have developed their own wetlands ecological integrity assessment, the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And then also in Washington State, the Washington Natural Heritage Program has developed a ecological integrity assessment for all upland ecosystems. So yeah, the approach is for really could be applied to any ecosystem.
James, did you have a question?
Yeah, this one's to Mike, I guess. You know, it strikes me that we see a lot more prescribed burning in some of the forests in the southern region. For instance, on the Kisatchie in their longleaf stands, they'll burn pretty much every 2 years or every 3 years. And so that means they're doing about 250,000 acres of burning a year. And I wonder if there'd be an opportunity to talk about success stories or experiences with prescribed burning in the Missouri Ozarks as a way to try to broaden or encourage the use of prescribed fire in the state, and especially in the context of natural areas or managed stands, such as the sorts of stands that Bill Holloman and Carl were just talking about.
Yeah, and we do have, there's the Oak Woodlands Fire Consortium too, which might be a good avenue for broadening that discussion. And then broadening, you know, I know one of the things with the Region 9 with the Forest Service is the southern tier, which have these oak dominated forests and ecosystems. And of course, here in the Missouri Ozarks, it's a lot easier for us to get oak regeneration than our neighbors to the east. So there's a big broad mesification, oak regeneration recruitment discussion to be had for sure. Okay, great. Yeah, please share this with folks, because I think there's a lot of good information here that I know not everybody, including in my agency, was able to join today. And it'd be great to get this information out to even more folks. And thanks for attending.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. We'll see you all at the next State Natural Areas Program Roundtable. Thanks.